The smoke had been visible for hours before the evacuation order came. Margaret Chen stood on her front porch in the hills outside Flagstaff, Arizona, watching the orange glow creep closer through the ponderosa pines. At 62, she'd lived through drought years before, but nothing like this. The Henderson Fire, they were calling it on the radio. "Ma'am, you need to leave now." The young firefighter's voice cracked with urgency as his truck pulled into her gravel driveway. Sweat streaked through the soot on his face. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the metal box containing David's military medals and their wedding photos. After 35 years of marriage, these were the only physical pieces of him she had left since the cancer took him 2 years ago. The house they'd built together, with its hand-carved kitchen cabinets and the garden where David had proposed, suddenly felt both precious and fragile. "Just 5 more minutes," she pleaded, looking back at the small adobe home with its red-tiled roof. "Ma'am, the fire's jumping the ridge. You got maybe 10 minutes before it's here." She loaded her car with the essentials, medications, the photo box, David's favorite flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of his cologne. As she drove down the winding mountain road, Margaret watched in her rearview mirror as orange flames crowned the trees behind her house. The evacuation center at Flagstaff High School buzzed with frightened families and crying children. Margaret sat alone on a folding chair, still wearing her gardening clothes, dirt under her fingernails from the morning she'd spent tending David's roses. The Red Cross volunteer offered her coffee in a paper cup, but her hands shook too much to hold it steady. "Fires jumped Highway 89, someone announced. Margaret closed her eyes and felt something inside her chest crack. Not break, but crack, like ice under pressure. 3 days later, when the winds finally shifted and the fire crews gained control, Margaret rode in a sheriff's deputy's vehicle back up the mountain. Her street looked like a war zone. The Johnson's house across the way had been reduced to a blackened foundation. The Garcia's place next door was somehow untouched, garden hoses still coiled neatly on their pristine lawn. Her house was gone, completely gone. Where her kitchen had been, she found the melted remains of David's coffee mug, the one with "World's Best Husband" that she'd given him for their 20th anniversary. The metal box with his medals had somehow survived in the debris, warped but intact. She sat in what used to be their bedroom and cried until her chest hurt. "You shouldn't be here alone." Margaret looked up to see a man standing at what used to be her front door. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with graying black hair pulled back and weathered hands. His dark eyes showed a familiar kind of sadness, the look of someone who'd lost things that couldn't be replaced. "I'm Jake Yazzie," he said, stepping carefully through the debris. "I work with the fire restoration crew. We've been clearing the area." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Margaret Chen, this was my home." Jake nodded, his expression softening. "I know." "I'm sorry." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I lost my house in the Schultz fire 10 years ago. Different fire, same feeling." Something in his voice made Margaret look at him more carefully. He wasn't just offering sympathy, he was sharing something real. "Does it get easier?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, looking at the twisted remains of her porch swing. "Different. Not easier, just different. You learn to carry it." The sun was setting, painting the sky the same orange color as the flames that had taken everything. Margaret realized she had nowhere to go. Her insurance agent had mentioned temporary housing, but the paperwork would take weeks. Her closest family was her sister in Phoenix, but they'd grown distant since David's death. "There's a good motel in town," Jake said, as if reading her thoughts. "The Pine Lodge, clean rooms, decent breakfast. The owner, Mrs. Rodriguez, she's been putting up folks from the fire for free." Margaret nodded, though the thought of staying in a strange room made her feel even more untethered. Everything that had anchored her to this place was ash now. "I can drive you there," Jake offered. "Your car's got ash all over the air filter. Shouldn't drive it until it's cleaned." As they walked to his truck, a well-maintained Ford with fire department decals, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the passenger window. Her gray hair was disheveled, her face streaked with tears and soot. She looked like a stranger to herself. You're Apache," she said as they drove down the mountain, not really a question. "Navajo," Jake corrected gently. "But I work with folks from all the tribes. We know fire." He paused. "My grandfather used to say fire takes what it needs to take. Our job is to figure out what we're supposed to do with what's left." Margaret stared out the window at the charred landscape. What if there's nothing left? Jake pulled into the motel parking lot and turned to look at her. There's always something left. Sometimes you just have to look harder to see it. The Pine Lodge Motel had seen better decades. The carpet was a faded burgundy, and the air conditioning unit rattled like a sick animal. But Margaret's room was clean, and Mrs. Rodriguez had indeed refused payment, pressing a thermos of homemade pozole into Margaret's hands with a fierce hug. "Mija, you eat," she'd said. "Grief makes you forget to eat, but your body needs strength." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring at the metal box containing David's medals. The Purple Heart gleamed dully in the lamplight. He'd earned it in Vietnam, though he'd never talked much about the war. "Some things are better left buried," he used to say. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Jake stood outside, holding a cardboard box and looking uncertain. "I went back to your property this morning," he said. "Found some things the fire missed." He set the box on the small table by the window. "Wasn't sure if you'd want them, but—" Margaret's breath caught. Inside the box were fragments of her life, a partially melted picture frame containing a photo of her and David on their wedding day, the ceramic owl David had given her for their anniversary, chipped but whole, and a small cactus plant in a scorched pot, somehow still alive. "The cactus was by your back door," Jake said. "Tough little thing." Margaret picked up the plant, its thick green flesh cool against her palms. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "David planted this when we moved in. He said it was like us, built to survive the hard times." Jake sat down across from her, his movements careful and deliberate. "You were married long?" 35 years. Met him when I was 24. He was this serious young sergeant, fresh back from overseas. I was working at the base hospital." Margaret smiled despite herself. "He came in for a routine checkup and asked me out 3 times before I said yes." "What made you finally say yes?" Margaret set the cactus down gently. "He brought me a sandwich. I was pulling a double shift, hadn't eaten in 12 hours. He noticed I was shaky from low blood sugar and went to the cafeteria, got me a turkey sandwich and a cup of coffee. Such a small thing, but—" She shrugged. Nobody had ever paid attention like that before. Jake nodded slowly. "Sounds like a good man." He was. Even at the end, when the chemo made him so sick he could barely keep food down, he'd still ask if I'd eaten. Margaret's voice cracked. "Cancer took him piece by piece. By the time he died, I was almost relieved. Terrible thing to say, but I was." "Not terrible," Jake said quietly. "I watched my father die the same way. Lung cancer. There's no shame in wanting someone's suffering to end." Margaret looked at him with new understanding. "Is that why you work with fires? Some kind of penance?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just the only thing I know how to do anymore." He stood up, running his hands through his hair. "I should let you rest." "Wait." Margaret surprised herself by reaching out to touch his arm. Would you like some coffee? Mrs. Rodriguez left me some, and I don't really want to be alone right now." Jake hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'd like that. They sat in the small motel kitchenette, drinking coffee that was too strong and talking about safer things, the weather, the rebuilding efforts, the other families displaced by the fire. But Margaret found herself watching Jake's hands as he spoke, noting the old burn scars on his knuckles, the way he moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous spaces. "How long have you been fighting fires?" she asked. 22 years. "Started right after I got out of the army." Jake stared into his coffee cup. "Lost my first house in '98. Smaller fire, but it took everything. My ex-wife, she couldn't handle starting over. Took our daughter and moved to California." "Do you see her? Your daughter?" Jake's smile was sad. "She's grown now, has kids of her own. We talk sometimes, but..." He shrugged. "You can't rebuild everything." Margaret felt a strange kinship with this man who carried loss like a weight in his chest. "Why do you stay here? Why not move somewhere without so much fire?" "This is home," Jake said simply. "The land doesn't care about our houses or our plans. It just is what it is. Fire's part of that. You can run from it, or you can learn to live with it." "I don't know how to live with it," Margaret admitted. "I don't know how to live with any of this." Jake looked at her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You don't have to know yet. You just have to keep getting up each morning until you do." The next morning, Margaret woke to find Jake in the motel parking lot, pressure washing the ash off her car. He'd also changed the air filter and checked her oil. When she tried to thank him, he just shrugged. "Figured you might want to drive up to the property again. Sometimes it helps to see it more than once." They drove up the mountain together, past the blackened landscape that was already showing signs of new growth. Tiny green shoots pushing through the charred soil. At her lot, Margaret walked through the debris more systematically, looking for anything else that might have survived. "Here," Jake called from what used to be the backyard. He was kneeling beside a partially buried metal box. "Looks like a toolbox." Margaret recognized it immediately. David's tools. He was always working on something, always fixing things. She opened the box to find his hammer, his favorite screwdriver set, a small level that had belonged to his father. "Good tools," Jake said, examining the hammer. "Built to last." Margaret picked up the level, feeling its familiar weight. "He taught me to use these. Said a woman should know how to fix things for herself." She looked around at the devastation. "I don't think I can fix this." "Maybe not," Jake said. "But you could build something new." The idea seemed impossible. Margaret was 62, alone, with barely enough insurance money to cover a small apartment somewhere. But as she stood there holding David's tools, she felt something she hadn't felt in months, a tiny spark of possibility. "I wouldn't know where to start," she said. Jake stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. "First thing is clearing the lot. Then you figure out if you want to rebuild here or somewhere else. Then you make a plan." He paused. "If you want help, I know people. Good people who do honest work." Margaret looked at him. This man who'd appeared in her devastation like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. "Why would you help me?" Jake's expression was serious. "Because somebody helped me once, and because..." He looked out at the mountains, choosing his words carefully. "Because some things are worth rebuilding." While 2 weeks later, Margaret stood on her cleared lot with a clipboard and a growing sense that she'd lost her mind. The debris had been hauled away, revealing the concrete foundation, cracked but solid. Around her, 3 men discussed plumbing and electrical requirements in a mixture of English and Spanish that made her head spin. "The foundation's good," said Carlos, the contractor Jake had recommended. "We can work with this." Jake emerged from what used to be the basement, covered in dust. Water lines intact. That's going to save you a couple thousand. Margaret stared at the architectural plans spread across a folding table. The house Jake had helped her design was smaller than the original, but smarter. Built with fire-resistant materials, better defensible space, solar panels that could keep power running even when the grid went down. "It's really happening," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Getting cold feet?" Jake asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "I haven't made a decision this big since David and I bought this place 40 years ago." Jake nodded. "Fear's not a bad thing. Means you're taking it seriously." Over the past 2 weeks, Margaret had been surprised by how much she'd learned to depend on Jake's steady presence. He'd helped her navigate insurance claims, driven her to meetings with contractors, and somehow managed to be available whenever she needed advice about building materials or local regulations. "You don't have to do all this," she told him one evening as they reviewed estimates at the motel. "I know," he'd replied, "want to." Now, watching Carlos and his crew mark the foundation for the new footings, Margaret felt a mix of excitement and guilt. Was she betraying David's memory by building something different, by letting another man help her create a new life? "Second thoughts." Jake appeared beside her, following her gaze. "David and I designed the original house together," Margaret said. "Spent months going over every detail. This feels different, like I'm erasing him." Jake was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather used to say that honoring the dead isn't about keeping everything the same. It's about taking the best of what they gave you and building something new with it." Margaret looked at him. "What did your father give you?" "Stubbornness," Jake said with a small smile. "And the idea that if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right the first time." "What about your ex-wife? What did she give you?" Jake's expression grew more serious. "The knowledge that I'm not easy to live with, that I carry things around that make me hard to reach sometimes." Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest. David used to say that about his war memories, said they lived in a locked room in his head, and sometimes the door would crack open when he wasn't expecting it. "Did that scare you?" "At first, but I learned to recognize the signs. When he'd get that distant look, I'd just be there, not trying to fix it, just there." Jake nodded. "That's more than most people can do." The sound of hammering interrupted their conversation. Carlos was setting up the framing for the new walls, and the skeleton of Margaret's future home was beginning to take shape. "I want to learn," Margaret said suddenly. "Learn what?" "How to build, how to do this myself." She gestured toward the construction site. "David always said I was good with my hands. Maybe it's time I found out if that's true." Jake looked at her with something like pride. "Carlos could use extra help. Pays decent wages, too. I don't need the money. I need to feel useful." The next morning, Margaret showed up at the construction site, wearing work boots and carrying a thermos of coffee. Carlos looked skeptical until she picked up a measuring tape and proved she could read the construction plans. "My husband was a mechanic," she explained. "I spent a lot of Saturday mornings in the garage, handing him tools and learning how things fit together." By the end of the week, Margaret had learned to use a nail gun, helped install subflooring, and discovered muscles she'd forgotten she had. Her hands, soft from 2 years of widowhood, grew calloused. Her back ached in new ways. But for the first time since David's death, she fell asleep each night feeling genuinely tired instead of just empty. Jake worked alongside her, patient when she made mistakes, encouraging when she got frustrated. He had a way of showing her how to do things without making her feel incompetent, holding a board steady while she learned to cut it, guiding her hands until she got the feel of the power drill. "You're a natural," he told her one afternoon as they installed kitchen cabinets. I'm 62 years old, Margaret replied. I don't think natural applies to anything I do anymore. Age doesn't matter. What matters is whether you're willing to learn. That evening, as they cleaned up the work site, Margaret found herself really looking at Jake for the first time. He was handsome in a weathered way, with laugh lines around his eyes and strong hands that moved with easy competence. When he smiled, which was becoming more frequent, his whole face changed. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said, as they loaded tools into his truck. "Sure." "Oh, why aren't you married? I mean, why aren't you with someone?" Jake paused, a drill bit halfway to the toolbox. "Honestly, I never thought I had anything to offer. After the divorce, after losing my house, I felt like damaged goods. And now," Jake looked at her directly, "now I think maybe being damaged doesn't mean you're not worth loving. Maybe it just means you understand what love costs." Margaret felt something flutter in her chest, a feeling she'd thought died with David. "Jake, I know," he said quickly. "I know you're not ready for anything like that. I'm not asking for anything, Margaret. I'm just saying that working with you these past weeks, seeing you rebuild from nothing, it's reminded me that people can surprise you." Margaret stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "You've surprised me too." They stood there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the distant sound of Carlos's radio playing Mexican ballads. Margaret felt the weight of all the reasons she shouldn't be feeling this way. Too soon, too old, too complicated. But she also felt the weight of Jake's steady presence, his quiet strength, the way he'd appeared in her darkest moment and helped her find the courage to build something new. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" Of feeling guilty for being happy, of dishonoring David's memory, of being too old to start over. Jake reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "My grandfather used to say that the heart doesn't have seasons. It just has weather, storms and sunshine, clouds and clear skies. You don't control the weather, but you can choose whether to stay inside or step out into it." Margaret squeezed his hand, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. "What if I'm not ready? Then we take it slow, one day at a time, one board at a time." Jake smiled. "We're building a house, Margaret. We've got time." 6 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of her completed home, holding a cup of coffee in a new mug, one that said "World's Best Builder" that Jake had given her as a housewarming gift. The morning sun streamed through the large windows they'd installed to capture the mountain views, and the smell of fresh pine lumber still lingered in the air. The house was smaller than the original, but it felt bigger somehow, more intentional. Every room had been planned with purpose, every detail chosen with care. The kitchen had a window over the sink that looked out onto the garden where she'd replanted David's roses. The living room had a fireplace with a stone hearth that Jake had built with his own hands, using river rocks they'd collected together. "Coffee's ready," Jake called from the kitchen. Margaret smiled at the sound of his voice in her space. He'd been staying over more often lately, keeping clothes in her closet, his toothbrush next to hers in the bathroom. Not officially moved in, but close enough that the house felt lived in rather than just inhabited. "Coming," she replied, but she lingered in the doorway a moment longer. The property looked different too. They'd cleared more defensible space around the house, planted native grasses that were less likely to burn, installed a sprinkler system that could wet down the roof if another fire threatened. Margaret had learned to read the weather patterns, to watch for red flag warnings and high wind advisories. She'd become someone who prepared for fire season instead of just hoping it wouldn't come. "You're going to be late for work," Jake said, appearing beside her with a travel mug. Margaret had surprised herself by taking a job with Carlos's construction company, What had started as helping with her own house had turned into steady work, rebuilding other homes lost to fires. She discovered she had a talent for finish work, the detail carpentry that made a house feel like a home. Mrs. Patterson's house. First day of kitchen cabinets, Margaret confirmed. She's been waiting 4 months for this. Jake nodded. The Pattersons had lost their home in the same fire that took Margaret's. Unlike Margaret, they'd decided to rebuild exactly what they'd lost before. Same floor plan, same materials, same vulnerable positioning. Margaret understood the impulse, but she also worried about what would happen when the next fire came. "Be careful today," Jake said, kissing her forehead. "That property's got a lot of beetle-killed trees around it." "I will." Margaret paused at the door. "What about you? Where are you working today?" "Brush clearing up on Oak Creek. Preventive work." Jake's expression grew serious. "Fire season's starting early this year. We're already seeing hotspots in areas that should still be too wet to burn." Margaret felt the familiar twist of anxiety in her stomach. Living in fire country meant accepting that loss was always a possibility. But she'd learned that accepting possibility wasn't the same as being paralyzed by it. "I'll see you tonight," she said. "I'll be here." At the Patterson job site, Margaret worked alongside Tommy, Carlos's youngest son, installing the base cabinets. Mrs. Patterson, Helen, hovered nearby, checking every measurement and asking frequent questions about the finish. "Are you sure this is the right color?" Helen asked for the 3rd time, holding up a door sample. "It looks different in this light." Margaret set down her drill and looked at the older woman with patience. Helen was in her 70s, had lived in her original house for 40 years. The fire had taken not just her home, but her husband's woodworking shop, where he'd spent his retirement years making furniture for their grandchildren. "It's the same color you picked at the showroom," Margaret said gently, "but you're right that it looks different here. Natural light changes throughout the day." Helen nodded, but her hands were still shaking as she held the sample. I keep thinking about what Bill would say. He was so particular about finishes." Margaret recognized the expression on Helen's face, the lost look of someone trying to honor a memory while building something new. What kind of finish did he like? "Oh, he was all about the natural wood grain. Said paint was just a way to hide poor craftsmanship." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "He would have hated these painted cabinets." Margaret looked at Tommy, who was pretending not to listen while he leveled a cabinet box. "Helen, can I show you something?" She led the older woman to the living room, where the framing was still exposed. Margaret pointed to a beam that ran across the ceiling. "See how this wood has character, the grain pattern, the natural color variation." Margaret suggests restoring Helen's cabinets in a way that honors Helen's late husband, Bill, stripping the paint and revealing the natural wood grain. Helen, touched by the idea, asks Margaret to do the work personally. Moved, Margaret agrees. Later that evening, Margaret tells Jake about the project as they work together in the garden. She's transplanting rose seedlings, and he's building a trellis. Jake remarks on her growing reputation and how she's changed. Margaret reflects that she no longer feels fragile but strong because of what she's survived. Jake gently reminds her she's not alone anymore. This leads to a turning point. Margaret tells Jake she loves him. It's a love different from what she had with her late husband David, but just as deep. Jake admits he's loved her for months, but waited for her to be sure. They share a quiet, intimate moment, recognizing that age doesn't matter. What matters is the life they're building together now. As they stand in the garden, surrounded by roses that survived both fire and replanting, Margaret senses David's presence not as a ghost, but a blessing. His love gave her the strength to love again. She sees in their rebuilt home not just survival, but a future. Before bed, she catches her reflection, older, weathered, but radiating hope. The fire had taken her old life, but from its ashes she built something new, a home, a partnership, and a renewed heart. As the mountain wind moves outside, Margaret falls asleep beside Jake, embraced by a love that has weathered storms and still burns strong in the quiet dark.